Hello, Caroline. Sorry about that. I don't know why I moved my hand to block my own face. Anyhow, yes, here I am. So I am not standing at the walls of Mycenae, but I am going to talk a little bit about the destruction. And I've been talking a bit about the Odyssey because the film had come out. So I wanted to bring in some of those things about Troy and stuff. And of course, the Mycenaeans were a key part of the Trojan War. I believe that is in the film. You do see Agamemnon, his brother Menelaus. Mycenae was a major empire, a major ruler for quite a few hundred years, and their origins are still up for grabs. They were Greeks. Where they exactly came from, well, they probably were one of the tribes that managed to sort of slowly take over an area, quite militaristic, and they managed to, of course, build the great city of Mycenae. And if you go to Greece, you want to go see that Lion Gate because you will see evidence of fire, and the site was actually burned down. So we have the palatial period, and around 1200, there's that 1200 BC date again, the end of many of the Bronze Age civilizations, including, of course, the Minoans were pretty well done by then. And what you will see is the burning of that gate. It still stands, but it definitely has scorch marks on it. So that is from the last stage, probably about 1100 to about 1050 BC. They call that the post-palatial period. By then, you would have had already the kings, anybody that would have survived any of those civil unrest wars would have already fled. So there wasn't much left at that point. The grand era was over. So I just want to talk a little bit about some of the reasons what's going on there with Mycenae and that decline. And essentially, what you seem to have is, I've talked about this in my other videos. I've brought in the sort of things that were happening with the climate in terms of there were a lot of earthquakes happening in a 50-year period. And that sort of all ties into that end date. It's the same date you get over and over. As well as the earthquakes, there were a few volcanic eruptions, nothing unusual in Greece. Not as big as the Thera one, but nonetheless, it continued. And there seems to be this arid period, this dry period. And there are some scientists basically that have been looking at from sediment samples and also from pollination. They can take the pollen and they can see how much was growing in terms of crops and whether or not you had a sufficient amount of water coming down in terms of rain. And it looks like you don't. So there is this period of about, some say it's the high level is 300 years, some say it's less than 100. It doesn't matter, it's still decades. We're talking a dry, arid period leading up to that 1100 BC date. And it looks like it was pretty darn dry around then. Now I'm going to, there is the name of someone. I'm going to put their article in here if you want to read it further. I just need to look at the name myself because I'm quite tired. So Brandon Drake. So Brandon Drake was a scientist, and he was especially looking at this idea of, did the climate help contribute to the end of the Bronze Age as well? And obviously we talked about arid situation is going to mean less crops. So we have the evidence that it was indeed happening, as well as these earthquakes. Now, we don't have tons of evidence of, where the city's shattering. Mycenae didn't fall apart with an earthquake. This was an eruption like Pompeii. Nothing was frozen in time. What happens is there looks to be a certain amount of unrest as well as invaders. Now, the civil unrest is usually to do with the people. So we're talking about the people have, a revolution. They've risen up, there's issues. And with dry periods, what are you going to get? You're going to get famine. People are not going to be fed. They're going to get very angry because if you read some of the Linear B tablets, if you want to do that on a Friday night and read the translations, mostly they are dealing with trade, numbers, and inventories in terms of dispensing goods, dispensing food is a big thing with these kind of kingdoms. And you're not going to have that when you don't have excess in your granaries. When you don't have your granaries, they've been destroyed, you're definitely not going to be feeding the people. People can only tolerate that so much, it would appear in history. This is very common. So the reason they feel it was a civil unrest within Mycenae as well is because the other structures outside of the inner palatial period, palatial center, are not burned, but the gates are burned and the palace is destroyed. All right. And you don't find a lot of remains of weapons or anything because they would have fled probably, or whoever won would have taken what was left over. And on that note, that leads us to discuss the possibility of the invaders. And I believe I mentioned in the Odyssey, they talk about the sea peoples, the mysterious sea peoples. So could the sea peoples have come? Well, we don't have enough evidence for that, but we shouldn't rule that out. We do know that there probably was some Dorians that might have come down from the north, and the Dorians, being outsiders, also look to play a pivotal role because they end up in a valley, and I believe it's like Ulysses. I'm going to have to put that down there. I'm sorry. Anyhow, this valley is in Sparta. So they are sort of known as the ancestors of what later became the Spartan kingdom. Okay, so the Dorians are key. They speak a Doric type, a dialect of Greek, whereas in Athens they speak an Ionian dialect of Greek. So that stays in Sparta. So we know that comes from these Dorians, and they feel these Dorians, they were, and you can see the connection with Sparta, a very militaristic society, very much about fighting, very much about arms. And here's what's interesting. What are the Dorians also called? One of their nicknames in Greek? They are like the iron workers. So now we're bringing in new technology in terms of weaponry, and that is really key because a bronze sword isn't going to stand up well to an iron sword. And there was a particular sword that was a slasher sword in rough terms. It was called that, and it has to do with the type of damage it can do, and it would have been made out of iron. So these Dorians, with their military front as well as their probably desperation, again, a lot of people were running around fleeing, dealing with the starvation, dealing with the chaos, dealing with civil unrest. Well, they bring iron with them, and now we enter the Iron Age. This is very key. When you have a superior type of weaponry, that's when you're going to see changes. So that's also very important for the end of Mycenae, the Mycenaean kingdom and the empire. I think that's something that needs to be discussed too, more probably in its own video. So on that note, I'm going to leave you, and we have the Dorians come down, the Mycenaean empire starts to fall apart, and yes, as Nolan brought into the whole movie, do the Mycenaeans also go out and go rogue and sail around and become part of the Sea Peoples group? Very likely, very likely. We'll talk more about that another time. All right, this is a bit longer than I thought, so take care. We'll talk later.